But first tonight, to Israel's war on terror. Israel rescues one hostage in a difficult operation while a new axis of evil emerges. Netanyahu rightly rejects calls for a ceasefire, and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says Israel and Egypt are prepared to let hundreds of Palestinian foreign citizens leave, but Hamas has refused. In one glimmer of good news, Ori Megadesh, a young female soldier held hostage, has been rescued by Israeli special forces. Ori, just a teenager at 19, was captured by Hamas while serving at a lookout on the southern border. She's now the first to be brought home by Israel's intelligence services and special forces as part of the ground operation in Gaza. And she had an emotional reunion with her family, and dozens of people who don't even know her gathered outside her family's home to celebrate. One rescued, 238 more to go. Hamas released a hostage video of 3 Israelis who make demands for a ceasefire and the exchange of prisoners. They attack the Netanyahu government. One angrily demands that Netanyahu set them free. Israeli media hasn't shown the video because it's part of Hamas's propaganda campaign, and here Sky News has made a decision not to show any hostage videos. This war that Israel was forced into after the October 7 terror attacks can't be seen in isolation from world events. Hamas is financed and armed by Iran, which reportedly gave the terror organisation the green light to attack Israel. There's now an axis of evil that's emerged, an anti-Western alliance between Iran, North Korea, Russia and China. Foreign Affairs editor for the Australian Greg Sheridan today writes that the strategic cooperation between these 4 nations is now intense. He writes there's an axis of evil that's emerged, an anti-Western alliance. He says North Korea is supplying weapons to Russia. The day US President Joe Biden visited Israel, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing, lavishly hosted by Xi Jinping. He writes that Putin in turn hosted Hamas leaders in Moscow. Iran supplies deadly drones in large quantities to Russia, and Putin has pledged Russia's long-term support for North Korea. Sheridan writes that not since World War II has the West been so strategically threatened as today. All of the West's most powerful and important enemies are involved in military attack against it, or supporting attack by their allies, or proclaiming they plan to attack soon. And Sheridan goes on to write about how the mass demonstrations we're seeing around the world are often blatantly anti-Semitic. And he writes that the momentary outrage we saw has basically effectively disappeared. It's actually unbelievable how quickly the world moved on from the October 7 terror attacks to now demand of Israel a ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has overnight categorically ruled out a ceasefire, as he should.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
Now, a ceasefire would let Hamas continue to butcher and slaughter and burn Jews unimpeded. The Times of Israel's editor, David Horowitz, writes about this phenomenon, and he clearly explains the anti-Semitism that's behind the demand for a ceasefire. He says the shock is expanding now to horror, disappointment and fury at the shift outside Israel from brief initial empathy for all those whose lives were shot and burned and butchered away, for their bereft and broken families, and for the innocent snatched away into Hamas's underground hellholes to a rising global effort to deprive us of the right to ensure it will not happen again. He writes, a rising global effort propelled by Israel haters and anti-Semites, assisted by falsehoods and misrepresentations everywhere, from TikTok to supposedly responsible media, and inflated by fools, to try to halt our military response or limit and undermine it. He says basically to tell us that what happened on October 7, if it happened, was terrible, but we need to get over it, subverting never again and telling us instead, well, yes, almost certainly again. Really powerful words and a powerful column from him in the Times of Israel. And as Horowitz so eloquently wrote, at the very heart of the calls for a ceasefire is anti-Semitism, that Hamas should be allowed to continue to slaughter Jews. He points out that if Hamas is not stopped, the monsters will be back stronger and more inhumane. Well, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong should take note, because they have horrifically been lecturing Israel about how it should respond, advocating a humanitarian 2-day pause, giving Israel military advice about where and how to attack. How embarrassing. Is it any wonder Netanyahu still hasn't returned Albanese's phone call from 3 weeks ago? Albanese and Penny Wong need to think about the advice they are giving, because Israel goes above and beyond its obligations under international law to protect civilian life. Israel has evidence that Hamas is operating under the Shifa hospital, but it hasn't taken action in order to protect the lives of its enemy. The fact that the Albanese government has been so arrogant as to offer unsolicited military advice to Israel is something the former prime ministers alluded to in the letter they co-authored that supported the Jewish community. The letter that John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, and Scott Morrison all wrote. In summary, it said that there's no place for anti-Semitism. They express support for Israel and the Jewish community, as well as Australian Palestinians who've lost family members. And they went on to explain how Hamas is solely responsible for this war, how Hamas is killing both Israelis and Palestinians. Instead of lecturing Israel, as the Albanese government has done, this letter said this line, have a look. On the battlefield in Israel and Gaza, we do not presume to give strategic advice to Israel, but the legitimate objective of defeating Hamas must be accompanied by support and protection for the civilian population of Gaza. Israel promises it will do all it can to avoid civilian casualties. We urge it to do so with all of its humanity and skill. I mean, compare that language to Albanese and Penny Wong's. And the start of the statement by the former PMs was an unequivocal censure of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to read this part again. I did last night, but I'm just going to read this short part again because it's so healing to hear the former Prime Minister say that actually this anti-Semitism we're witnessing, we're experiencing, is not acceptable. They wrote, and I quote, "There is no more tenaciously evil race hatred than anti-Semitism. Our Australian Jewish community, directly affected by the terrible crimes of Hamas, not only has to endure the loss and suffering of their families in Israel, but now sees these events being used by some to spread ancient hatreds which have inflicted so much suffering on the Jewish people for thousands of years. We believe we speak for the vast majority of Australians of all faiths and of none when we say we stand in solidarity with Jewish Australians at this time." It genuinely is a brilliant letter that strikes the right tone, and all of those former PMs should be praised for it. It makes me genuinely sad that none of these leaders are here to protect the Jewish community, to stand in solidarity with the Jewish community and with Israel at this time. Any one of those former PMs, however flawed, would be a better friend to Israel and Jewish Australians than Albanese, would show more leadership at this troubled and traumatic time. Today, Albanese, briefly back on Australian soil, was asked if he supports this letter by the former PMs. He couldn't utter the words to say he supported it. He didn't support it. Have a look.
I support the positions that I've taken, and the position in the Parliament last Monday was done with overwhelming support. It is important that we recognise that the attacks from Hamas on Israel are worthy of absolute condemnation in an unequivocal way. It's also important to recognise that Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it does that matters. And we need to make sure as well that every civilian life is valued, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian. Every innocent loss of life is a tragedy. And that is why we remain very concerned and continue to put forward our case while we've provided humanitarian assistance as well to Gaza. Some $25 million has been provided so far.
The Albanese left-wing beating heart has never been more exposed on international affairs, at what some believe is an inflection point in history, than comparing his words today with those of the previous 6 prime ministers. Why doesn't Albanese call on Hamas to protect their own civilians by letting them flee to safety in the south? Why doesn't he call on pro-Palestinian supporters to condemn and denounce the hatred of Jews which is spilling out onto the streets of Sydney and Melbourne? Why doesn't he call out the blatant anti-Semitism in those pro-Palestinian protests and the barely disguised anti-Semitism erupting at university campuses, in arts communities and in other institutions? Why can't he be clear? Why isn't he, in no uncertain terms, condemning Islamic terror, which at its core has a hatred of Jews and infidels, including the United States and, of course, Australia? It's hard not to conclude that Albanese's long-held position as a radical anti-Israel activist is now driving decisions out of the lodge. Yes, he utters some words of comfort, but to many in the Jewish community, it's how he says it and what he isn't saying that has left so many disappointed. Why hasn't the Australian Prime Minister managed to speak to the leader of one of our greatest allies, Israel, a friend whose security forces thwarted a terror attack in Australia and whose democratic values we actually share? Well, perhaps it's because since becoming Prime Minister, Albanese no longer recognised West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that was a bungled announcement that gave Israel no warning. Then his government described East Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territories, denying any Jewish claim to Jerusalem. And he described Israeli West Bank settlements as illegal under international law. Under Labor's updated policy, Judaism's holiest sites, the Temple Mount and the Western Wall, are now considered to be in occupied Palestinian territory. Albanese personally has a long history of anti-Israel commentary, and I've shown it to you several times on this program. It's why he's now speaking about Israel's war on terror with both sides of his mouth. We have a crisis of anti-Semitism. Yes, globally, but also right here in Australia. There's intergenerational trauma from Holocaust survivors and the children of survivors. Mothers are terrified about sending their children to school. Teenagers are scared to walk on the streets. And Albanese, back on home soil this week, has done nothing about it. He hasn't addressed it. He hasn't said a word. Our leaders have failed to utter a word of comfort. This is catastrophic. Jewish communities feel unsafe. Everyone else is speaking about it. It's front page of the Australian newspaper today, and even the Today Show covered it this morning.
Well, what is worrying me out here and in Australia and other parts of the world is this surge in anti-Semitism. I mean, why is there this underlying level of hatred towards Jews? Well, we've got 100,000 Jews in Australia, 800,000 Muslims, and yet we've got this developing tension that really worries me. It even legitimised some idiots outside our courts last week saying Heil Hitler. There is a lot of my Jewish friends, I was talking to one who's in Europe at the moment, he's frightened to go out in Europe. And a lot of them have been telling me this anti-Semitism is building, and it seems to be happening now. We've got to stop it.
Stronger words from Neil Mitchell than we've seen from our Prime Minister. In Australia, we're seeing a crisis of anti-Semitism and a crisis of leadership.